It was just after 9 o'clock on a humid Phoenix night when Chief Marshal Daniel Cross made the mistake that would destroy his 24-year career. In less than 72 hours, his arrogance would trigger an FBI probe, topple a police network, and change federal law. You won't believe who he grabbed and what happened next. Watch to the end, subscribe for more, and don't forget to like and share this story. It was just after 9 o'clock on a humid Phoenix night, the kind where the heat from the day still clung to the pavement like a stubborn shadow, when Chief Marshal Daniel Cross made the mistake that would shatter not only his career, but the protective wall he had built over nearly a quarter-century in law enforcement. The Phoenix Federal Courthouse stood like a silent fortress under the glow of amber streetlights, its towering granite facade throwing long shadows across the nearly empty parking lot. Federal Judge Alicia Monroe had just concluded a 14-hour day in one of the most complex racketeering trials the Ninth Circuit had seen in years. At 47, Monroe was known for her precision, her unshakable courtroom demeanor, and a legal mind as sharp as the edge of a scalpel. She had fought her way from the streets of Oakland, where she first worked as a civil rights litigator defending victims of police misconduct, to one of the highest judicial seats in the West. Tonight, she carried a slim leather briefcase containing sensitive case files that could decide the fate of men who believed they were untouchable. 3 blocks away, Chief Marshal Daniel Cross was seething behind the wheel of his department-issued black Ford Expedition. At 54, Cross was both decorated and infamous, a man celebrated in City Hall for his tough-on-crime image, but whispered about in back alleys of the department for his temper, his unchecked biases, and his habit of reminding people of his authority through intimidation. His month had been a nightmare. Clearance rates were plummeting, budget cuts had gutted his operations, and Internal Affairs had quietly opened 2 new investigations into his conduct. That evening, his team was running a low-level drug sweep in the blocks surrounding the courthouse. The operation had yielded nothing but frustration. No weapons, no contraband, not even a solid arrest. Then came the radio crackle at 8:57 p.m. Suspicious activity near the federal courthouse. Multiple individuals loitering near the parking area. Cross's jaw tightened. Federal property meant federal oversight. And that meant paperwork. The kind of paperwork he hated. But a call was a call. And Daniel Cross had built his career on the idea that you never backed down from a chance to show the flag. As his SUV rolled toward the courthouse, his headlights swept over 3 young men in business attire standing near the visitor parking area. They weren't street dealers, though. They were federal court clerks heading home after preparing exhibits for the racketeering trial. Cross didn't know that, and in truth, he didn't care. To him, they looked out of place, and that was enough. Meanwhile, Judge Monroe had just stepped out of the secure parking garage, her heels clicking in measured rhythm on the concrete. She noticed the cluster of marked cruisers surrounding the men and paused in the shadows, observing. Something about the way Cross's officers were positioned, hands near their holsters, bodies squared aggressively toward the clerks, set off alarms in her mind. She had seen this dance before, the slow ratcheting of intimidation disguised as procedure. Federal jurisdiction or not, she knew that a show of force in a courthouse parking lot could easily spiral into something worse. Cross pulled his expedition in hard, tires crunching against loose gravel, and stepped out like a man preparing for battle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence he cultivated for maximum impact, pressed uniform, polished boots, and a stare meant to pin people to the pavement. His stride across the parking lot was fast and deliberate, each step a signal that someone was about to be reminded who was in charge. As he approached, the humid night air carried the faint scent of hot asphalt and the low murmur of the clerks trying to explain themselves. Then he saw her. In the dim halo of the parking lot, lamps stood a black woman in an elegant navy suit, holding a leather briefcase and watching him approach with a calm, steady gaze. She was maybe mid-40s, impeccably composed, and entirely unafraid. Cross didn't recognize her, at least, not yet. What he saw, instead, was an interruption, a problem. In his mind, she was just another civilian wandering into a law enforcement operation where she didn't belong. The unspoken hierarchy in his worldview placed himself, white, male, uniformed, at the top. She was questioning that order simply by standing there. "Ma'am, you need to step back," he barked, his voice carrying the gravelly authority of decades in uniform. "I was just wondering," she replied, her tone even and clear, "if I could understand the legal basis for this detention." That was all it took. Her words, spoken without a tremor, landed in his ears like a challenge. He didn't hear the courtesy. He heard defiance. His shoulders squared, his chest expanded, and in a heartbeat, every ounce of stress, prejudice, and pent-up frustration from the last month coiled into a single, reckless impulse. He closed the gap between them in 3 strides, reached out, and grabbed her by the arm with a grip honed from years of physical control tactics. In one swift motion, he shoved her against the side of his SUV, the metal reverberating under the impact. "You're interfering with police business," he growled, pressing his knee into her lower back. "And you're under arrest." The briefcase slipped from her hand and hit the asphalt with a sharp crack, spilling folders across the ground. Pale yellow case file covers fluttered in the night air, each stamped with bold black letters. United States District Court, 9th Circuit. Under the sodium glow, the gold federal seals seemed to glint like warning lights. Cross didn't look at them. He didn't see the seals, didn't register the authority they represented. But Alicia Monroe did. And so did the 3 junior officers who had been standing nearby. They saw the papers, saw the unmistakable markings of documents that did not belong to an ordinary civilian, and for the first time, doubt began to creep into their posture. Monroe's voice came, calm but edged with steel, muffled slightly by the position he forced her into. "Chief Marshal Cross, badge number 1148. Your direct supervisor is Deputy Commissioner Harold Stokes, extension 5521. You are currently in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242. Deprivation of rights under color of law." The 3 officers froze. Ordinary people didn't know those numbers. Only law enforcement veterans, lawyers, or federal judges spoke that language with such precision. But Cross, locked inside his own tunnel vision, heard only a black woman telling him what he could and couldn't do. His grip tightened. "I don't care who you think you are," he snarled. "You're going to learn some respect." In that moment, Daniel Cross crossed an invisible line from arrogance into catastrophe. Above them, high-definition courthouse security cameras silently recorded every frame. 2 blocks away, a federal security operations center was already taking notice of the feed. And in less than 90 seconds, the protocols that would dismantle Daniel Cross's life would be set in motion. Because he hadn't just laid hands on a civilian. He had assaulted federal Judge Alicia Monroe, one of the most respected jurists in the 9th Circuit, a woman who had personally overseen cases that sent corrupt officers to prison, dismantled criminal enterprises, and rewritten the rules of police accountability. And unlike his previous victims, she had both the knowledge and the authority to summon an army of federal enforcement that even he couldn't intimidate. Within minutes, the parking lot would flood with armed federal agents. But in that moment, under the dim orange lights, all Cross saw was someone he thought he could put in her place. What he didn't see What he couldn't see was that his 24-year career was already over. And Judge Monroe, still steady under his weight, knew exactly how to ensure that when he fell, he would take his entire corrupt network down with him. The metal of the Ford Expedition's door panel was still reverberating from the impact when Alicia Monroe straightened her posture as much as she could under the pressure of Daniel Cross's knee. Her cheek was pressed to the cool surface, but her voice came out clear, deliberate, and laced with the kind of authority that did not need volume to command a room or a parking lot. "Chief Marshal Cross," she said, her tone precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "Badge number 1148. Your direct supervisor is Deputy Commissioner Harold Stokes, extension 5521. You are currently in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. And, given the circumstances, you are rapidly approaching violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 245, federally protected activities." Each statute rolled off her tongue with the ease of someone who had lived and breathed them for decades, someone who could recall their subsections the way others remembered the words to a childhood song. Her words were not a plea. They were a ledger entry, a matter-of-fact statement for the record, delivered as if the cameras in the lot, the officers standing nearby, and the Federal Security Center monitoring the live feed all needed to hear it. And they did. Cross, however, did not. Or rather, he refused to. In the narrow, self-contained universe of his ego, the sound of a black woman, any black woman, telling him what law applied to him was a provocation. To admit the legitimacy of her words would mean admitting she had the standing to speak them. And Cross had built his entire professional identity on denying that kind of standing to people like her. His hands moved with mechanical precision to his belt, unclipping the handcuffs that had left their mark on hundreds of wrists over the years, some deserving, many not. "Hands behind your back," he barked, not as a request, but as an inevitability. The hollow clink of the cuffs swinging open was sharp in the humid air, punctuating the low hum of the parking lot lamps. "Chief Marshal," Monroe said, still steady, "you should stop now." He didn't. The right cuff closed around her wrist with the metallic finality of a cell door. Cross's knee pressed harder into her back, his breathing heavy, his eyes fixed on the task, as if the act itself could reassert the authority he felt slipping. The second cuff was halfway closed when movement flickered in his peripheral vision, the shift of weight, the sideways glance, coming from his own officers. There were three of them. Officer Ramirez, 7 years on the job, broad-shouldered but now visibly uneasy. Officer Kent, a fresh transfer from Tucson, still figuring out who was safe to cross in the department. And Officer Lee, barely 6 months out of the academy, whose knuckles were white where they rested against his utility belt. All three had frozen at Monroe's recitation of Cross's badge number, chain of command, and the exact statutes in play. Civilians didn't know that kind of detail. Even most lawyers couldn't have recited them so fluidly, on the spot. Ramirez's eyes darted to the briefcase lying open on the ground, the papers splayed like a crime scene diagram, the gold seals, the headers reading United States District Court, 9th Circuit, the classification marks. This was no ordinary paperwork. These were documents you didn't even photocopy without clearance. And here they were, scattered under the sodium glow like breadcrumbs, leading straight to a truth no one wanted to name out loud. Kent shifted uncomfortably. He had heard Monroe's name before. Everyone in the Southwest legal and law enforcement circles had. She was the judge who had ruled against the Phoenix PD in a landmark civil rights case 5 years ago. The ruling had forced the department to overhaul its use of force policy, and the resentment still simmered in certain precincts. Kent didn't know much about her beyond that. only that she was not someone you laid hands on lightly. Or at all. Lee's stomach churned. He'd grown up in Phoenix, watched family members hassled and searched for fitting descriptions, and had joined the force telling himself he could be one of the good ones. But now, here he was, feet from a scene that would end careers, maybe his own if he said the wrong thing. The urge to speak, "Captain, I think she's a judge," rose in his throat, but fear choked it back. In the academy, they taught you to cover your partner, not contradict your superior in the field, especially not a chief marshal with a reputation like Cross's. The cameras saw it all. Mounted high on the courthouse facade, their lenses drank in every detail: the exact angle of Cross's grip, the tilt of Monroe's head, the tension in the other officers' postures. Inside the Federal Protective Service Operations Center, a bank of monitors flickered with feeds from 12 different angles. An operator leaned forward, his hand moving instinctively to a phone that connected directly to the on-call supervisor. "Possible code 9, he said, voice tight. "Courthouse property. Looks like a uniformed local is detaining—" "Wait, confirming ID? Holy, yeah, it's Judge Monroe. Repeat, Judge Alicia Monroe." Back in the lot, Cross snapped the second cuff closed, the steel biting into Monroe's skin. She didn't flinch. Instead, she shifted her weight just enough to lift her chin, turning her head until her eyes met the nearest camera mounted above the garage entrance. "This," she said quietly, not to Cross but to whoever was watching, "is an unlawful arrest on federal property." It was both a statement of fact and a flare fired into the night, the kind that called in reinforcements measured not in minutes, but in seconds. Cross's breathing was heavier now, his adrenaline spiking. He had her in cuffs. That meant control. That meant order restored. But what he didn't know, what his officers were beginning to grasp in the hollow behind their ribs, was that he had just handcuffed the one person in this entire city who could dismantle his career before sunrise. Ramirez shifted again, glancing toward the street. Kent's hand twitched near his radio. Lee swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. The silence among them was its own kind of complicity, heavy as the night air, suffocating as the knowledge that they were on the wrong side of something far bigger than a routine sweep. "Walk!" Cross ordered, yanking Monroe by the arm toward the back of the expedition. Her heels clicked twice against the pavement before she stopped dead, forcing him to either drag her or halt. She tilted her head slightly, voice low but sharp enough to cut. "You have just compounded your violations, Chief Marshal. Every second you continue is another count in the indictment you will face." Cross jerked her forward. "Lady, I don't care if you're the Queen of England." "You will," she interrupted, her tone as steady as the granite courthouse behind her. "Care very much." In the distance, the low rumble of engines began to grow, a sound just faint enough that Cross didn't register it yet. But Ramirez did, and Kent, and Lee. 3 engines, maybe more, moving fast, no sirens, just the deep, resonant thrum of vehicles built for response, not patrol. Above, the cameras kept recording. In the ops center, the supervisor was already on the line with the U.S. Marshals tactical team. Response time, 90 seconds. Daniel Cross still thought he was in control. But Alicia Monroe, calm and cuffed, knew the truth. The power gap between them was about to become a canyon. And when the reinforcements arrived, he would learn exactly what it meant to step over the invisible line between authority and lawlessness, on federal ground, under federal eyes, against a federal judge who never forgot a face or a badge number. The distant rumble that had been threading through the humid Phoenix night was now distinct, a low, mechanical growl that carried with it the weight of inevitability. It swelled from faint vibration to full-bodied presence, echoing against the courthouse walls and rattling the loose pebbles near the curb. Officer Ramirez felt it in his boots before he fully heard it, a physical warning crawling up from the soles of his feet to the pit of his stomach. Kent caught the sound next, his gaze snapping toward the street. Lee didn't need to look. He recognized that engine note from Academy briefings. Federal, not city. Inside the Federal Protective Service Operations Center, the call had already gone out. The moment the facial recognition software confirmed Alicia Monroe's identity, the system didn't ask for permission. It executed pre-programmed protocols designed for exactly this nightmare scenario, a threat to federal judicial personnel on federal property. The alert had gone out in less than 4 seconds. Within 10, the U.S. Marshal's Service, the FBI's Phoenix Field Office, and the DOJ's Civil Rights Division had the same blinking red notification on their secure devices. Priority 1. Federal judge threatened. Immediate response required. 90 seconds after the code went live, 3 black Chevy Suburbans and 1 unmarked Dodge Charger were tearing through the city grid without sirens, their LED light bars pulsing in a cold, strobing rhythm. The convoy was led by Special Agent Carla Reyes of the U.S. Marshals, a 20-year veteran with the kind of reputation that made even other federal agents think twice before crossing her. At 44, Reyes had a face carved from stone and eyes that could cut a man in half without ever raising her voice. She had been in the middle of a tactical debrief when the call came in. By the time she was behind the wheel, her tactical vest was already strapped on, her sidearm loaded, her mind calculating the quickest route to the courthouse. Back in the parking lot, Cross still had Monroe cuffed, the steel biting into her wrists, his knee occasionally jamming against her spine to remind her that, at least for now, gravity was on his side. He hadn't noticed the change in the air yet, the subtle shift in posture from his own men, the absence of background chatter from their radios. The tension, sharp enough to slice through the muggy air, that signaled the moment before something irreversible happened. The sound hit first. A coordinated deceleration, tires biting asphalt, followed by the slick whisper of doors opening in perfect sequence. 4, 6, 8 boots hit the pavement in unison. Shadows stretched long under the parking lot lamps as armed figures in tactical gear moved in a diamond formation, their weapons held low, but ready. Cross turned his head just as the lead figure broke formation and strode toward him with the unhurried precision of someone who had been trained to command without wasted motion. Chief Marshal Cross, Special Agent Carla Reyes said, her voice flat but resonant, carrying just enough to be heard by every ear in the lot, "Release the individual immediately and step away from the vehicle." Cross's brow furrowed, his grip instinctively tightening on Monroe's cuffed arm. "Excuse me, this is an active police operation." Reyes cut him off, her tone sharpening like a knife sliding from its sheath. "That individual is Federal Judge Alicia Monroe, 9th Circuit. You will release her now." The name landed like a body blow. Ramirez inhaled sharply, his eyes flicking to Kent and Lee. Kent's jaw went slack. Lee felt his knees weaken. Monroe. Judge Alicia Monroe. They all knew the name now, even if they'd pretended not to moments ago. The judge who had ended careers with a single ruling. The judge whose decisions were cited in training manuals. The judge who could walk into a federal prosecutor's office and have a civil rights indictment drafted before lunch. Cross didn't move. The words reached him, but he clung to his last, fragile sense of control. "I don't care if she's the—" "Don't," Reyes said, taking another step forward, her hand hovering over her sidearm, not as a threat, but as a statement. 2 marshals flanked her now, their faces hidden behind ballistic helmets, their eyes locked on Cross. Monroe, still cuffed, spoke without turning her head. "Agent Reyes, For the record, I am unharmed. However, Chief Marshal Cross is in active violation of Title 18, Sections 242 and 245. This incident occurred entirely on federal property. The statement was both a confirmation and a legal framing, captured not only by the courthouse security cameras, but by the body cams on all three of Cross's officers, whose blinking red lights now felt like countdown timers on a bomb they couldn't defuse. Reyes didn't take her eyes off Cross. "You're done here. Hands off. Step back." Something in her tone finally pierced his armor. His hand unclenched, the cuffs rattled, and Monroe's arms dropped to her sides as Reyes gestured for another marshal to remove them. The moment the steel clicked open, Monroe rotated her wrists, flexing them once, and retrieved her briefcase from where it lay on the ground. She didn't bother dusting it off. "Thank you, Agent Reyes," she said evenly, before turning to the nearest camera and stating, "Time is 21:14 hours." For Ramirez, Kent, and Lee, the reality of what they had just witnessed began to bloom in their minds like a bruise spreading under skin. They had stood by while their superior officer assaulted a federal judge. They had heard her identify the statutes. They had watched the federal response unfold in less than 3 minutes, and now they understood what that meant. Investigations, depositions, subpoenas, the slow, grinding machinery of federal oversight rolling over every choice they had made tonight. Cross, however, still bristled. "I was conducting a lawful operation," he started, the edge of defiance still in his voice. "No," Reyes said, the word cold and clean. "You were committing a federal offense, and now you're going to be processed accordingly." She didn't need to raise her voice. The authority wasn't in her volume. It was in the fact that 2 more marshals were already stepping behind Cross, one removing his service weapon, the other unclipping his radio. The sound of Velcro tearing as his duty belt was loosened was louder than the low murmur of the other officers. Cross's breath came faster now, though his face remained rigid. For the first time, he noticed the marshal's vehicles angled in to block every exit from the lot. The Suburban's headlights painted the scene in stark white, throwing every face into sharp relief. Reyes turned her head just enough to address the officers still standing in a loose triangle nearby. "You 3 will remain on site for formal statements. Body camera footage will be surrendered to federal custody immediately." Ramirez nodded, throat dry. Kent swallowed hard. Lee simply stared at the asphalt. Monroe, now standing fully upright, adjusted her jacket as if she were about to walk into her courtroom. Her eyes moved from Cross to the nearest camera, then back to Reyes. "Agent Reyes, please ensure that the footage from cameras 7, 12, and 15 is preserved without interruption. Those angles will provide complete coverage." "Already done, Judge," Reyes replied without looking away from Cross. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. The title had been spoken aloud now, in front of his men, in front of the federal agents, in front of the cameras. Judge. Not ma'am, not lady, not civilian. Federal Judge Alicia Monroe. And with that one truth, everything he thought he controlled in this parking lot evaporated into the night air. The hum of radios, the shuffle of boots, the quiet authority in Reyes's voice, it all pressed in on him, making the space around his SUV feel smaller, hotter, harder to breathe in. But still, some stubborn part of him clung to the posture of defiance, as though a straight spine could hold back the weight of federal jurisdiction descending on him like a guillotine. He didn't know it yet, but every second from here on was no longer his. It belonged to the record, to the investigation, to the federal agencies that had been set in motion the moment he laid hands on her. And they would not stop until there was nothing left of the shield he had worn like armor for 24 years. The convoy of black Suburbans was still idling in the Phoenix Federal Courthouse parking lot when the next wave of the machine began to turn. Federal jurisdiction was a living thing. It didn't just arrive and leave. It spread outward in concentric circles, each ring pulling in more resources, more specialists, more weight. 35 minutes after Special Agent Carla Reyes ordered Daniel Cross to release Judge Alicia Monroe, the incident packet, containing Monroe's on-scene statement, the high-resolution surveillance stills from cameras 7, 12, and 15, and the initial witness notes from Officers Ramirez, Kent, and Lee, was encrypted, tagged, and routed to the FBI's Phoenix field office. Within 11 minutes of arrival, it landed in the queue of Special Agent Elliot Tan. Tan was 41, deliberate in everything, and known inside the Bureau for an almost unnerving ability to take a chaotic mess of information and lay it out like a chessboard. Every piece, every move, every consequence visible at once. He had cut his teeth in the organized crime section out of Chicago, taken down a handful of dirty cops in St. Louis, and earned a quiet reputation for methodical precision in police corruption cases. He didn't rush, he didn't guess, he documented. And then he dismantled. When Tan opened the file labeled U.S. v. Daniel Cross, initial incident, he didn't start with Monroe's account, even though it was the crown jewel of credibility. He started with the footage. The Bureau's digital forensics team had already enhanced the parking lot video, stabilizing each frame until every detail was crisp enough to read badge numbers in the reflection of a car door. There was no ambiguity, no shadowed gaps. You could watch Cross grab Monroe's arm, see the shift of her balance as he shoved her into the SUV, catch the glint of the handcuffs as he locked them around her wrists. You could hear, in pristine clarity, her recitation of his badge number and the statutes he was violating. From there, Tan moved to Monroe's formal statement. It was 3 pages, single-spaced, delivered without hesitation less than an hour after the incident, while the memory was still fresh. Her language was surgical. No embellishment, no speculation, just a clean sequence of events with timestamps, officer positions, and direct quotes. She'd even noted the positions of the 3 junior officers relative to the nearest camera, effectively preserving the integrity of their future testimony. Tan had seen police chiefs forget half this much detail under oath. By the time he finished reading, the case wasn't a question of if a crime had been committed. It was a question of how far back the rot went. He requested Cross's personnel file from the Phoenix Department of Public Safety, knowing it would trigger a ripple in the local command structure. But Tan also knew better than to wait on them. Simultaneously, he authorized a sealed subpoena for internal city records, complaints, lawsuits, settlements, anything with Cross's name on it. The Bureau's own databases began to hum as the cross-referencing scripts ran in the background. The first hits came fast. 23 civilian complaints over the last 10 years. 12 use-of-force incidents resulting in injury. 8 allegations of racial profiling. But what made Tan sit back in his chair wasn't the volume. It was the uniformity of the outcomes. Every single complaint was unfounded. Every use of force was within policy. Every allegation of bias was unsupported by evidence. It was too clean. Tan had seen this pattern before, in Chicago's 24th District, and again in a New Orleans narcotics squad. The thread was always the same: a friendly internal affairs officer willing to massage the numbers, lean on witnesses, or quietly bury evidence before it could breathe daylight. That's when the name surfaced: Lieutenant Harold Kelso, head of internal affairs for Phoenix PD for the last 16 years. Kelso's signature appeared on 19 of the cleared cases. His internal memos used identical phrasing, like someone copying from a template designed to close files rather than investigate them. Even more telling, the few cases Kelso didn't touch? Those were the only ones where discipline had actually been imposed on Cross, and even then, it was minor. By 9 the next morning, Tan had a whiteboard covered in interconnected lines. Cross at the center, Kelso off to the right, a cluster of smaller names around them, supervisors who'd signed off on suspect incident reports, city attorneys who'd authorized quick settlements, union reps who'd intervened to resolve pending complaints. It wasn't a web so much as a protective shell, a system built to keep Daniel Cross in uniform no matter how many times he crossed the line. Monroe's role in this phase was relentless. Even though she was the victim, she positioned herself as a resource, supplying Tan with legal insight into the exact mechanisms that could pierce local protections. In their first post-incident briefing, she told him plainly, "If you want to crack Kelso, you need the complaint files the city marked as confidential. Those aren't going to show up in a standard subpoena. They're buried under civil litigation privilege." Tan listened, took notes, and then called the DOJ Civil Rights Division in D.C., requesting an emergency joint task force designation. That classification meant they could bypass the city's red tape entirely and pull every document through federal channels. When the first batch of deep records arrived, it was worse than he'd expected. Witness statements in Cross's cases were missing key pages, audio from body cams cut off in mid-incident. In one excessive force complaint, a victim's hospital records had been filed under the wrong case number, deliberately, according to a whistleblower note slipped anonymously into the file. The racial bias pattern was unmistakable. Over 70% of the complainants were Black or Latino. Many had been cited for vague catch-all infractions like obstruction or failure to comply, charges that conveniently justified stops and searches later deemed unconstitutional. Kelso's fingerprints were everywhere. In the margins of one report, someone, almost certainly Kelso, had scrawled, "Make sure this one disappears before IA review." The note was dated 2 days before the file was officially closed as unfounded. Tan didn't need more to see the scope. Cross was not just a bad cop with a short fuse. He was the protected centerpiece of a 2-decade-old ecosystem that insulated him from accountability. And Monroe had just given them the perfect, irrefutable flashpoint to blow it open. By the afternoon of Day 2, Tan had initiated preservation orders for every piece of digital evidence related to Cross, including hard drives from decommissioned patrol cars and archived dispatch logs. He also placed a quiet watch on Kelso's financial records, knowing from experience that loyalty in these arrangements often came with a price tag and paper trails. In a follow-up meeting, Monroe reviewed the high-definition footage again with Tan, noting subtle details. The angle of Cross's body relative to hers, the absence of any legitimate threat that could justify force, the positions of Ramirez, Kent, and Lee as passive observers. She spoke like a prosecutor building an opening statement, her tone calm but edged with the certainty of someone who knew exactly how airtight the case could be. "You have the incident," she told Tan, "but that's the tip. Every cleared file is another data point. Build the timeline. Show that the outcome was predetermined every time. Once you have that, you don't just have Cross, you have the system that made him inevitable." Tan nodded. This was no longer a standard civil rights case. This was the seed of a pattern and practice investigation, the kind that could put an entire police department under federal oversight for years. And it all started with a parking lot, a bad decision, and a woman who refused to be intimidated. By the end of that week, Tan had enough preliminary evidence to draft his first formal memorandum to the DOJ. Recommendation: initiate full civil rights investigation into Phoenix Department of Public Safety. Pattern of misconduct and systemic bias. In the corner of the memo, in neat block letters, he wrote the phrase Monroe had repeated to him more than once in their briefings. "This is bigger than one man." It began quietly. almost imperceptibly, like the first hairline fractures in glass. Barely visible unless you knew where to look. But Special Agent Elliot Tan knew exactly where to look. By the time the 5th day of the investigation into Chief Marshal Daniel Cross rolled around, the threads he had been pulling from Cross's personnel history began to reveal the man behind the curtain. Internal Affairs, Lieutenant Brian Kelso. Kelso had been the gatekeeper for 15 years, the man who decided which complaints against officers were worth pursuing and which were destined to vanish into the bureaucratic ether. In theory, IA was the immune system of a police department, designed to detect and eliminate infection. In practice, under Kelso, it had been the opposite, a shield for the worst offenders, a filter that let nothing damaging pass through. The files Tan's team recovered were textbook examples of engineered outcomes, statements altered, timelines adjusted, exculpatory evidence emphasized while incriminating details evaporated. One excessive force complaint against Cross from 7 years earlier had been filed by a schoolteacher whose arm had been broken during what was supposed to be a routine traffic stop. In her original sworn statement, she claimed Cross yanked her from the car without cause. The copy in IA's file contained a curious revision. Her account now included language about raising her voice and refusing to follow commands, phrases Tan recognized as boilerplate justifications for escalation. The kicker? Both statements bore her signature. A handwriting analyst confirmed the second signature wasn't hers. Witness intimidation was another recurring note in Kelso's melody of obstruction. In one 2014 incident, a local mechanic who had been roughed up during a street sweep claimed Cross slammed him against a wall and held him there with a forearm to his throat. 2 days before the IA interview, Kelso had personally visited the mechanic's shop. No one knew exactly what was said, but the man's subsequent testimony was stripped of any accusation. When pressed, he simply shrugged and said, "Maybe I remembered wrong." Tan's team was piecing together a chain, Kelso at the center, feeding off the political capital Cross provided. Cross's numbers looked good on paper. Arrests up, proactive policing metrics high. And Kelso ensured that whatever shadows came with those numbers never touched the official record. The payoff for Kelso was subtle but unmistakable. Promotions, choice assignments for his friends, and the kind of informal influence in City Hall that most IA officers never sniffed. The federal subpoena for Kelso's communications history was the crowbar that widened the cracks. Over 15 years, he had exchanged hundreds of text messages with Cross in the hours or days before key complaint reviews. Some were vague. "I'll take care of it. It's covered." But others were damningly specific. Witness 3 needs a reminder about cooperation. Or, "We're going with insufficient evidence. Stick to the script." The tone was always confident, like a man who knew no one would ever read his words. What Tan needed now was a voice from inside the department, someone who could translate the culture into testimony, someone whose hands weren't already stained. And that's when rookie officer Deshaun Price came into focus. Price had been on the job less than 8 months. He had been assigned to Cross's operation on the night of the parking lot incident, standing far enough back that he wasn't part of the physical confrontation, but close enough to hear every word. His body camera had captured the exchange between Monroe and Cross in full, including the moment she recited his badge number and the statutes. It also recorded Price's own voice, soft and hesitant, saying, "Captain, maybe we should," before Cross cut him off with a barked order. At first, Price was wary. In the unwritten code of policing, talking to outsiders, especially feds, about another officer was career suicide. But Tan's team approached carefully. They didn't press him in the first meeting. They let him sit in the observation room and watch the high-definition footage from the courthouse cameras. They let him see, side by side, his own body cam feed and the security footage, both telling the same damning story. And then they let him sit with it. When Tan finally asked, "Do you want to be part of fixing this?" Price's answer was a quiet, "Yeah, I do." Price's testimony became the wedge that split the network wider. He described the unspoken rules, how Cross's word was treated as gospel, how IA interviews with Kelso were less about gathering facts and more about reminding officers what version of events would keep the department out of trouble. He recalled a specific incident during training where Kelso himself had addressed the class, saying, "Remember, we handle our problems in-house. That's how we protect the badge." Price also recounted what happened in the minutes before Cross confronted Monroe that night. He'd been ordered to hold position and let the captain handle it, which, in hindsight, was a clear instruction to stay out of whatever was about to happen. His gut had twisted when Monroe spoke. Her vocabulary, her composure, the way she didn't flinch. "I thought," Price admitted, "that she might be someone important. But I didn't think—" His voice trailed off in the interview recording. He didn't need to finish. Armed with Price's account, Tan went back to the stack of IA files. The pattern of witness forgetfulness and complaint insufficiency wasn't random. It was cultivated. Supervisors like Kelso had created a climate where officers understood that contradicting the official version could stall their careers, or worse. In at least 4 cases, Price's fellow rookies had been reassigned after showing too much willingness to report misconduct. The message was clear: stay in line or get pushed out. The more Tan's team pulled, the more the network began to fray. Supervisors who once shielded Cross started to distance themselves in interviews, subtly shifting blame toward Kelso. A sergeant who had worked IA under Kelso for 3 years quietly contacted the DOJ tip line, offering to clarify certain file irregularities in exchange for limited immunity. Even a city attorney, long believed to be a rubber stamp for IA's decisions, admitted under questioning that there were cases where the outcome seemed predetermined. Monroe followed the developments closely. Tan briefed her on Kelso's exposure during their 3rd meeting in her chambers. She listened without interruption, hands folded on the desk, until he finished. Then she said, "You're seeing the architecture now. Kelso isn't just protecting Cross. He's the cornerstone. Pull him out, and the whole structure collapses." The collapse began in earnest on the 12th day. Armed with a federal warrant, Tan's team seized Kelso's home computer and a pair of locked file cabinets in his office. What they found was a personal archive of every major complaint against Cross, some in original, unaltered form, others annotated with Kelso's edits and margin notes. One folder contained a list of high-risk witnesses with addresses and phone numbers, many of whom had later withdrawn complaints. The implication was chilling. Kelso hadn't just been falsifying records. He'd been actively managing people's willingness to testify. That night, when news broke that Kelso was on administrative leave pending investigation, the ripple inside the Phoenix Department of Public Safety was immediate. Officers who had kept their heads down began making quiet inquiries about whistleblower protections. Old grudges against Cross resurfaced in the form of back-channel leaks to the press. And in the halls of City Hall, the mayor's office fielded its first serious questions about whether the department could survive a full federal takeover. For Daniel Cross, still officially on suspension, the shift was seismic. The fortress of loyalty he had counted on for decades was crumbling. The man who had signed his clean bills of health after every questionable incident was now a suspect himself, and the rookie he'd barely noticed, just another fresh face in uniform, was talking to the feds. The cracks were no longer hairline. They were spreading, fast and loud, the sound of safety glass shattering in slow motion. and everyone inside the network knew. Once the pieces started falling, there would be no putting them back together. It started as a man in handcuffs in a courthouse parking lot. But by the end of the third week, it was no longer just Daniel Cross on trial. It was the institution that had made him possible. The cracks Tan had exposed through Brian Kelso's files widened until the Department of Justice could see daylight straight through the Phoenix Department of Public Safety. And daylight, in this context, was lethal. Once the DOJ's Civil Rights Division saw the depth and consistency of the misconduct, they didn't just keep building the criminal case, they invoked one of the most feared tools in their arsenal. 42 U.S.C. Paragraph 141, the statute authorizing pattern and practice investigations into law enforcement agencies engaged in systematic violations of constitutional rights. The decision was swift. 14 days after Tan's preliminary memo hit the desk of Civil Rights Division Chief Elaine Porter, a formal notice landed on the desks of Phoenix's city leadership. It was written in the kind of clinical legalese that masked its devastation. The Department of Justice has determined there is reasonable cause to believe that the Phoenix Department of Public Safety has engaged in a pattern or practice of conduct that deprives persons of rights, privileges, or immunities secured or protected by the Constitution or laws of the United States. In simpler terms, we're not just taking Cross, we're taking the keys to your department. When City Manager Linda Navarro read the letter, her first instinct was disbelief. Federal oversight wasn't just bad optics, it was political radiation. No mayor wanted to run a city under a consent decree. It meant years, sometimes decades, of expensive reform, constant monitoring, and the humiliation of knowing your police department couldn't be trusted to police itself. She called an emergency meeting with Mayor Greg Torres, the city attorney, the police chief, and half the city council. The mood in the room was part panic, part denial. Police Chief Robert Hanley tried to downplay it, insisting the DOJ wouldn't have the resources to go after a department this size. But Tan's team had already anticipated this defense. The evidence was overwhelming. 15 years of altered IA reports, 27 confirmed excessive force incidents brushed off as within policy, 43 complaints of racial bias that mysteriously evaporated, and now a cooperating witness inside the department willing to testify under oath. This wasn't a hunch. This was a documented, mathematically undeniable pattern. Navarro leaned forward in that meeting, the DOJ letter in her hand, and said flatly, "They're coming. And when they do, they won't just take Cross. They'll put us under a microscope so powerful you'll be able to see the cracks in our badge enamel." By then, the local media had already built its own narrative. On the Phoenix Evening News, the footage played on a loop. Cross shoving Monroe into the SUV, her calm recitation of his badge number. The black Suburbans pulling in like a scene from a movie. The anchors framed it as the fall of a decorated but controversial officer. They mentioned Kelso, hinted at possible irregularities in internal affairs, and reported on the federal inquiry with a tone of cautious curiosity. National media, however, smelled blood in the water. The Washington Post ran a front-page piece titled, "From Badge to Federal Target: How One Arrest Exposed a Department's Secret History." CNN's legal correspondent explained to viewers what a pattern and practice investigation meant. This is the same federal tool used to reform the LAPD after Rampart, to put Ferguson PD under a consent decree, to overhaul Baltimore PD after Freddie Gray. If DOJ is serious, Phoenix PD will not look the same 5 years from now. And then the op-eds started. Civil rights advocates called the case a once-in-a-generation chance to dismantle structural corruption. Former DOJ monitors wrote columns outlining the likely reforms: mandatory body cameras, independent use of force reviews, civilian oversight boards, federal audits of complaint investigations. One commentator put it bluntly, "This is no longer about Daniel Cross. It's about the ecosystem that fed him." Inside the Phoenix PD, the atmosphere curdled. Officers who once swaggered through roll call now spoke in lowered voices. The blue wall that had protected Cross for decades was showing visible gaps. Some veterans still insisted the feds would overreach and eventually pull back. Others quietly started polishing their resumes for jobs outside law enforcement. The DOJ wasn't waiting for internal sentiment to catch up. Special Agent Elliot Tan's team expanded overnight, bringing in civil rights attorneys, forensic accountants, and digital evidence specialists. They set up shop in an unused city building, turning it into a command center where walls were plastered with timelines, flowcharts, and color-coded maps of misconduct clusters across the city. The data painted a devastating picture. Misconduct wasn't random. It was concentrated in certain units, certain supervisors' commands, certain neighborhoods, mostly Black and Latino, where patterns of unconstitutional stops, searches, and uses of force were baked into daily operations. For Monroe, the expansion was confirmation of what she had suspected since the night Cross grabbed her arm. This was never just about one man's arrogance. She stayed in close contact with Tan, reviewing affidavits, connecting him with legal scholars who could bolster the DOJ's eventual findings, and quietly reaching out to community leaders who had been documenting abuses for years. The city's PR machine tried to stem the tide. Press releases framed Cross as an isolated incident and Kelso's misconduct as a failure of oversight by a single officer. But the narrative collapsed each time Tan's team filed another motion in federal court attaching exhibits, dozens of them, showing identical complaint language, identical clearance memos, identical witness retractions. You could lay them on top of each other and see the template. By the fourth week, Navarro had to brief the city council on the worst-case scenario: full federal takeover of the department. She explained the mechanics: a consent decree negotiated in federal court, a monitor appointed to oversee compliance, millions of dollars in reform costs spread over a decade. "We can cooperate now," she told them, "or we can fight and lose even more later." The mayor, still clinging to the hope of containment, asked, "What if we just focus on Cross and Kelso? Make them the villains and cut them loose?" Navarro didn't flinch. "The DOJ already has the pattern. It's bigger than them. We can't scapegoat our way out of this." When that meeting adjourned, the local press had already picked up rumors of the DOJ's letter. The next morning's headline on the Arizona Sentinel read, "Phoenix PD faces federal control. City officials scramble." Monroe read it over coffee in her kitchen, the paper spread across the counter. The photo beneath the headline was of Cross, being led away in cuffs from the courthouse parking lot, the SUV headlights flaring behind him. In the background, you could see her, standing tall, hands free, flanked by federal agents. It wasn't a victory photo. It was a portrait of inevitability. She knew the real fight was only beginning. The DOJ's involvement meant reform would be codified, monitored, enforced. But it also meant years of resistance from inside the department, political pushback from city leadership, and the grinding pace of federal oversight. For Tan, it meant his investigation had shifted from a sprint to a marathon. Cross's prosecution would run in parallel to the larger civil rights case. Each witness in Cross's trial was a potential doorway into another facet of the department's culture. Each subpoena for IA files was also evidence for the consent decree negotiations. By week 5, the public narrative had locked into two parallel tracks. Locally, the downfall of Chief Marshal Daniel Cross, the man whose ego brought him down. Nationally, the exposure of systemic corruption inside Phoenix PD, a case study in how decades of unchecked misconduct could be peeled back by a single recorded incident. And somewhere between those narratives, Monroe kept working, testifying in closed-door sessions with DOJ attorneys, reviewing draft reform proposals, and making it clear that whatever political pressure the city tried to exert, she wasn't stepping back. In the end, what began as one officer's crime was now a looming institutional collapse. And every player involved, Cross, Kelso, City Hall, the rank and file, was learning the same brutal truth. Once the feds have the pattern, the practice won't survive. The morning the hammer dropped, Phoenix woke to sirens. Not the wail of patrol cars racing toward a crime scene, but the blunt, surgical hum of a coordinated federal takedown. At exactly 6:30 a.m., across 7 different locations in the city, FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and DOJ investigators executed arrest warrants that had been signed in a sealed federal courtroom just 12 hours earlier. Chief Marshal Daniel Cross was pulled from his home in the upscale Arcadia district, barefoot and furious, the smell of his morning coffee still drifting from the kitchen. At the same hour, Internal Affairs Lieutenant Brian Kelso was cuffed outside his condo near downtown, his half-packed duffel bag sitting abandoned in the doorway. And on the city's northern edge, Deputy Chief Alan Rourke, once untouchable in his starched uniform, was hauled from his driveway in sweatpants, his neighbors peering from behind blinds as unmarked SUVs swallowed him whole. The indictment was staggering. 42 pages, dense with counts that read like a laundry list of institutional rot. Conspiracy to obstruct justice, civil rights violations under color of law, falsification of public records, racketeering in furtherance of criminal enterprise. The racketeering charge alone was a seismic escalation. RICO statutes weren't usually aimed at police departments, but the DOJ had framed the network of falsified reports, witness intimidation, and coordinated cover-ups as an organized criminal operation. By mid-morning, the U.S. Attorney for Arizona stood at a podium flanked by 2 massive poster boards, one showing the mugshots of Cross, Kelso, and Rourke, the other a spiderweb diagram of 22 other officers implicated in the scheme. Not all were under arrest, but each name on that chart was a career circling the drain. The press conference was live-streamed nationwide. For 15 years, the U.S. Attorney said, his voice steady but sharpened with outrage, this network exploited its authority to shield misconduct, silence witnesses, and target vulnerable communities. Today, that ends. This is not the fall of one man. It is the dismantling of a culture of impunity. The shockwave inside Phoenix PD was immediate. Officers who had believed they were untouchable now calculated their odds in federal courtrooms. Some hardened veterans doubled down, vowing to ride it out in silence. Others, the ones who had been complicit but not central, started calling lawyers before the indictment ink was dry. By the end of that week, at least 6 officers had quietly agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences, their sworn statements adding brutal detail to the DOJ's case. One officer described being instructed by Kelso to fix a use-of-force report after Cross tackled a teenager during a protest arrest. Another admitted to deliberately switching off his body camera during a raid because the captain said it was an intel op. Each confession was another nail in the coffin, not just for Cross, but for the entire hierarchy that had protected him. Cross, meanwhile, sat in a federal holding cell, his attorney issuing statements about political witch hunts and misinterpretations of police protocol. But behind the scenes, the reality was harsher. His bank accounts had been frozen under asset forfeiture laws tied to the racketeering charges. The DOJ had traced over $200,000 in questionable consulting fees funneled through a shell company connected to a former city contractor. His home, valued at over $1.2 million, was tagged with a federal lien. Even his pension, once guaranteed, was under review for forfeiture. For a man who had built his persona on power, command, and financial security, the collapse was personal. His wife, Marianne, stopped attending court hearings after the first week. Friends in the department stopped returning her calls. Their 2 adult children, both living out of state, issued a joint statement through an attorney. "We are aware of the charges and ask for privacy at this time." It was polite, distant, and clearly designed to signal a quiet separation from the man at the center of the storm. Kelso's fall was no less spectacular. For years, he had been the silent engineer of the department's self-protective machinery. Now, stripped of his badge and escorted into federal court in an orange jumpsuit, he looked like a man staring down the sudden vacuum of a life without influence. The evidence against him was suffocating. Altered witness statements in his own handwriting, emails coordinating with Rourke to bury damaging cases, and a personal notebook listing pressure points on key complainants, medical debts, family vulnerabilities, immigration status, that prosecutors argued was a blueprint for targeted intimidation. Deputy Chief Alan Rourke's inclusion in the indictment was the DOJ's way of signaling that the cancer went all the way to the top. His charges tied him directly to budgetary decisions that funneled resources toward units with the highest misconduct rates while starving oversight programs of funding. Financial records showed he'd approved discretionary overtime for loyal officers involved in covering Cross's most controversial arrests. His public image as a steady hand in city leadership now lay in ruins, replaced by the grainy booking photo flashing across every news broadcast. The national press feasted. The New York Times ran a Sunday feature titled "The Blueprint of Corruption: How Phoenix PD Built Its Own Shield." NPR aired a 3-part investigative series, weaving Monroe's calm defiance the night of the arrest into the larger narrative of institutional betrayal. On cable news, legal analysts dissected the RICO angle, noting how rare it was for federal prosecutors to wield it against police networks, and how devastating it could be in sentencing. Inside the DOJ's Phoenix Command Center, Tan marked each flipped officer on a wall chart with a red tag. By the second week post-indictment, nearly a third of the implicated officers had agreed to cooperate. Some were minor players who had followed orders without asking too many questions. Others were mid-level supervisors who realized the paper trail could bury them unless they started talking. The details they provided didn't just corroborate the existing charges, they pointed to additional misconduct outside the original scope, including questionable shootings, falsified overtime, and illegal surveillance of community activists. Every new statement added weight to the case, but it also tightened the clock. Cross's defense team was already maneuvering to sever his trial from Kelso and Rourke's, hoping to cast him as a lone actor in a rogue faction. DOJ attorneys pushed back hard, arguing that the conspiracy was inseparable, that Cross's power was a direct product of Kelso's cover-ups and Rourke's resource allocation. Monroe watched the developments from a deliberate distance. She'd given her testimony, met with DOJ lawyers, and kept her public statements measured. But those who knew her could see the satisfaction in the way she carried herself now. The night in the parking lot had been one act of arrogance. What came after was proof that arrogance had been systematized, industrialized, and normalized, until the system collapsed under its own weight. When the first pre-trial hearing convened, the courtroom was standing room only. Cross sat between his 2 attorneys, jaw tight, eyes forward. Kelso avoided looking at him entirely. Rourke stared at the floor. The federal prosecutor laid out the charges in a voice that carried through every corner of the room, each count like the tolling of a bell. Conspiracy, obstruction, deprivation of rights under color of law. racketeering. By the time the hearing adjourned, the writing was on the wall. This wasn't going to be a quiet plea deal or a tidy dismissal. This was a public reckoning, with every step documented, televised, and dissected. And for the people of Phoenix, especially those whose complaints had been buried for years, it was the first time the system had been forced to acknowledge what they'd been saying all along. For Cross, Kelso, and Rourke, the consequences were now measured not in disciplinary memos, but in federal sentencing guidelines. Years, not weeks. For the department they had commanded, the consequences were existential. The DOJ's oversight would stretch for years, reshaping the institution in ways that would outlast every career in that courtroom. And somewhere, beyond the reach of the cameras, Monroe knew the truth the headlines wouldn't capture. This wasn't the end. It was the start of a long, painful dismantling of everything that had allowed men like Cross to believe the law was theirs to command, and theirs to break. The Cross case had already detonated in Phoenix, but for Judge Alicia Monroe, that was never the finish line. From the moment the DOJ's indictment landed, she understood the stakes were bigger than one city, one department, or even one state. What had happened in that courthouse parking lot could happen anywhere, and it already had, in different forms, across the country. Phoenix was just the latest flashpoint, but Monroe intended to make it the last one that could burn unchecked. She began her campaign quietly, even as Cross, Kelso, and Rourke's trials were splashed across headlines. While DOJ prosecutors assembled their mountain of evidence, Monroe was assembling her own network, not of lawyers or agents, but of lawmakers, policy experts, and community leaders. She reached out to civil rights advocates from Ferguson, Baltimore, Minneapolis, cities that had already endured their own reckonings. She invited retired police chiefs who had successfully reformed departments under federal consent decrees. She called former DOJ monitors, legal scholars, and, most importantly, families who had lived through the consequences of unchecked police misconduct. Her goal was ambitious: a national legislative framework that would strip away the patchwork of local oversight and create clear, enforceable standards for accountability. She drafted the bones of the proposal herself, measured language that would appeal to both reformers and pragmatists in Congress. At its heart were three pillars. First, independent oversight boards with subpoena power in every jurisdiction receiving federal law enforcement funding. No more internal affairs units run by the same command staff they were supposed to investigate. These boards would be made up of civilians, former prosecutors, and retired officers from outside the department. Second, mandatory body-worn cameras for all officers, with strict rules for activation and immediate disciplinary consequences for violations. No more selective recording. No more malfunctioning cameras at critical moments. Third, automatic DOJ review of any excessive force incident occurring on federal property, from courthouse steps to post office lobbies. That last one was personal. It was the safeguard that would have stopped Cross cold the moment he grabbed her arm. By the time she unveiled her proposal publicly, she had given it a name that no one in Washington could easily dismiss: the National Law Enforcement Accountability Act. The first press conference was staged with surgical precision. Monroe stood at the podium in a Navy suit, the seal of the U.S. Capitol behind her, flanked by a bipartisan group of lawmakers, Democrats who had long pushed for police reform, and Republicans who framed the bill as a pro-law measure that would restore trust between officers and the communities they served. Cameras clicked in a staccato rhythm as she laid out the numbers. Over the last 15 years, she began, her voice calm but resonant, the Department of Justice has opened 36 pattern and practice investigations into police departments nationwide. In that same period, over 900 civilians have died in incidents later determined to involve excessive force. And yet, without consistent federal oversight, the same failures repeat in different zip codes, under different names. Phoenix is not an outlier. Phoenix is a warning. The bill gained traction faster than even Monroe expected. The Cross case was still dominating news cycles, and the public's appetite for reform was sharp. National opinion polls showed that a majority of Americans, across political lines, supported measures for greater accountability in policing. Editorial boards in major newspapers endorsed the proposal, framing it as a measured, nonpartisan step toward restoring integrity in law enforcement. The resistance, of course, came quickly. Police unions decried the bill as federal overreach. Certain lawmakers dismissed it as a solution in search of a problem, despite the mountain of evidence to the contrary. But Monroe had anticipated every objection. For every claim of overreach, she pointed to the constitutional authority Congress already held through federal funding conditions. For every claim that local control was sacred, she pointed to the decades of local failures that had led to tragedies like hers. She was relentless without being abrasive, authoritative without being condescending. In committee hearings, she dismantled bad faith arguments with the same precision she'd used in her courtroom. She quoted case law, DOJ statistics, and even internal police training manuals. She told stories, not just her own, but those of people like the schoolteacher whose arm Cross had broken, the mechanic intimidated into silence, the teenagers stopped for looking suspicious in their own neighborhoods. She made it impossible for lawmakers to reduce the bill to abstract policy. And then, something rare happened in Washington. Momentum built in both parties. For Republicans from rural districts, Monroe framed the oversight boards as guardrails that would prevent bad actors from tarnishing the badge for the majority of honorable officers. For progressive Democrats, she framed them as community voice mechanisms with real teeth. The language was the same law, but the framing was tailored to each audience. Behind the scenes, she worked with the DOJ to ensure the bill's provisions dovetailed with existing consent decree protocols. That meant implementation could be swift once the law passed. Her coordination with DOJ Civil Rights Chief Elaine Porter also ensured that Phoenix's reforms, now unfolding under federal oversight, served as a live case study in how the law could work nationwide. When the bill finally reached the House floor, the debate was fierce but surprisingly constructive. Lawmakers cited Phoenix repeatedly, invoking Monroe's calm defiance in the parking lot as the catalyst for national change. One congresswoman from Illinois put it bluntly, "If a federal judge can be assaulted by a police chief on federal property, and the only thing that stops him is luck, then the system is not working." The House passed it with a comfortable margin. The Senate was tighter, but Monroe's strategic coalition building paid off. Key swing votes came from senators who had been mayors in cities under consent decrees. They understood the costs of reform, but also the costs of letting misconduct fester. On a crisp October morning, the National Law Enforcement Accountability Act cleared its final vote, 58 to 42. The signing ceremony on the White House lawn was broadcast live on every major network. Monroe stood in the front row, her hands clasped, as the president signed the bill into law with a navy blue pen. The applause was thunderous, but Monroe's satisfaction was quieter, steadier. She knew that passing a law was only the first step. Enforcing it would be the real battle. Still, the fact that the law existed at all, a national standard born from a single night's confrontation, was a testament to how quickly a crack in the system could be widened into a breach. In Phoenix, the news was met with a mix of pride and defiance. Reform advocates celebrated the law as a victory that began on their streets. The remaining loyalists inside the department grumbled about federal babysitting, but knew the tide had turned. Across the country, mayors and police chiefs began preparing for the reality that accountability was no longer optional. It was the law. For Monroe, The journey from that parking lot to the White House lawn was more than personal vindication. It was proof that the ripples of one act, one moment of holding her ground, could move through courts, communities, and Congress itself. And in the months to come, as the DOJ began its first wave of automatic reviews under the new statute, Monroe kept her focus where it had always been, on the next case, the next reform, the next opportunity to remind the nation that the badge and the law must serve the same master: justice. The day of sentencing drew a crowd that stretched around the block of the federal courthouse, the same building where Daniel Cross had once walked in and out as if it were his personal fortress. Now, wearing a plain gray suit and the expression of a man who had run out of places to hide, he stood before the judge to hear the words that would close the chapter on his career and his freedom. The courtroom was packed, reporters elbowing for space, victims seated in reserved rows, federal agents and DOJ attorneys lined along the walls. Judge Morales read the sentence with the solemnity of a funeral. 14 years in federal prison, followed by permanent disqualification from holding any position in law enforcement or public service. The language was deliberate. There would be no second act, no quiet reassignment in another jurisdiction. When the gavel fell, it was more than a legal judgment. It was the burial of an entire way of operating. Kelso received 12 years. Rourke, 10. The courtroom clerk's voice echoed as she read each judgment into the record, the air thick with the realization that the leadership of Phoenix PD's old guard had been dismantled in a single sweep. But the consequences reached far beyond the defendants. Outside the courthouse, Monroe gave a statement flanked by DOJ Civil Rights Division Chief Elaine Porter and Special Agent Elliot Tan. Her words were measured but sharp enough to cut through the noise of cameras clicking and protesters chanting. Power without accountability is not law enforcement, it's lawlessness, she said, looking directly into the nearest news camera. And when lawlessness wears a badge, it corrodes the very foundation it claims to defend. That ends here. That ends now. While Cross began adjusting to life in a federal facility 2 states away, Phoenix PD was entering an entirely different kind of sentence. A 5-year federal monitoring program mandated by the consent decree negotiated in the wake of the DOJ's investigation. The decree was sweeping. It required every officer to complete new de-escalation and bias training within the first year. It established a civilian oversight board with full subpoena power and independent investigative staff. It mandated body cameras for all field officers, with footage stored in a secure third-party system to prevent tampering. It even required quarterly public reports detailing use-of-force incidents, complaint outcomes, and disciplinary actions. For some officers, these changes were a relief. Finally, a chance to work without the shadow of corruption hanging over every interaction. For others, it felt like shackles. Resistance came in subtle forms: slow compliance with camera rules, grumbling in locker rooms, whispered bets on how long the reforms would really last. But the federal monitor, a no-nonsense former prosecutor named Lydia Carver, made it clear from day one that this was not a symbolic exercise. Her team audited everything, from arrest reports to training logs, and every failure to meet the decree's requirements was documented and addressed in real time. Meanwhile, Monroe's role in shaping not just Phoenix's recovery, but the national conversation on police reform, expanded dramatically. Her leadership in pushing the National Law Enforcement Accountability Act through Congress had not gone unnoticed. Just 6 months after the bill was signed into law, the Attorney General announced her appointment as chair of the DOJ's newly formed Federal Advisory Panel on Law Enforcement Reform. The panel's mission was ambitious: oversee the implementation of the Act across all 50 states, advise on best practices for compliance, and recommend additional legislative measures as needed. For Monroe, it was not a ceremonial role. She traveled relentlessly, visiting cities from Boston to Baton Rouge, sitting in on community forums, meeting with chiefs of police, and listening to the people whose lives had been upended by misconduct. She carried a leather-bound notebook filled with their stories, accounts of beatings, wrongful arrests, harassment, that she used to remind lawmakers and law enforcement leaders that every statistic was a person. Her speeches became a fixture on national broadcasts. In one address to a joint session of the Congressional Black Caucus and the Senate Judiciary Committee, she spoke without notes, her voice steady but pulsing with conviction. "We cannot pretend that misconduct is the exception when our structures are designed to protect it. We cannot keep rewarding silence with promotions and retaliation with shields. If we want safety, we must first ensure justice. And justice requires that the law's first loyalty is to the people, not the badge." By the third year of Phoenix's federal monitoring, early signs of change were visible. Use of force incidents had dropped by 28%. Civilian complaints were down, not because they were being buried, but because trust in the oversight process was slowly being rebuilt. Officers who had once refused to wear cameras were now using them as protection against false claims. Community meetings, once sparsely attended, were now standing room only, with residents and officers actually engaging in dialogue instead of staring at each other across a gulf of distrust. Still, Monroe knew progress was fragile. Reform could not be a moment. It had to be a culture. That's why, in her 5th year as chair of the advisory panel, she pushed for a permanent federal funding stream to support local oversight boards nationwide. She argued that without resources, oversight would be nothing more than a box to check, vulnerable to the next budget cut or political shift. By the time Phoenix completed its 5-year monitoring program, the department was almost unrecognizable from the one Cross had commanded. The Oversight Board was a fixture of city government, trusted enough that even some officers privately admitted it had made their jobs easier. Training academies taught recruits not just how to enforce the law, but how to see themselves as guardians of public trust. Cross, by then, was deep into his 12th year behind bars, with 2 more to serve before release. His name had become shorthand in police reform circles, not as a symbol of strength or authority, but as a cautionary tale of what unchecked power could destroy. At the closing press conference marking the end of Phoenix's consent decree, Monroe stood at the same podium where she had once announced the passage of the National Law Enforcement Accountability Act. Her hair had more silver now, her face the map of someone who had carried weight heavier than her own life. She spoke plainly, without rhetoric, knowing that everyone in the room understood the cost of the last 5 years. "This city was broken," she said. "It took courage to face that truth, and it took commitment to fix it. But let's be clear, this isn't a finish line. Accountability is not a phase. It is a constant practice, one we must choose every day. The moment we forget, that is the moment we start losing what we've built." The applause was long, but Monroe didn't linger in it. She had a plane to catch, another city, another department, another battle waiting. Because in her mind, the fight was never over. The Cross case had been the spark, Phoenix the proving ground, and the reforms the blueprint. But the real work, she knew, was making sure the next time someone in uniform thought about abusing their power, they'd remember what happened here, and think twice. And as she left the podium, her words from years before still hung in the air like a promise or a warning. Power without accountability is not law enforcement. It's lawlessness. The story of Daniel Cross and Judge Alicia Monroe is more than a courtroom drama. It is a mirror held up to America. It shows us, with painful clarity, What happens when authority goes unchecked, when silence becomes the default response to wrongdoing, and when the systems meant to protect us, instead, protect themselves. It began with a single moment, a shove in a parking lot late at night, and unfolded into 14 years in federal prison for a man who once thought he was untouchable. 5 years of federal monitoring for a broken police department and a national law that now stands as a safeguard for every American. The lesson is simple, but urgent. Accountability does not happen on its own. It must be demanded, defended, and renewed every single day. We cannot assume that justice will arrive just because the Constitution promises it. Justice lives or dies in the choices we make, in the courage to record, to speak, to vote, to challenge. We must remember that every badge, every robe, every elected office is not a shield against the law, but a responsibility under it. If we allow power to drift without oversight, we will find ourselves living under lawlessness disguised as law. If we want safe streets, we must insist on just policing. If we want integrity in our courts, we must hold even the most powerful to the same rules as the least powerful. The Cross case is not just Phoenix's story. It is a warning and a roadmap for every city, town, and citizen. We, the people, have the authority to demand change, but only if we refuse to look away. So watch this story, not just for the drama, but for the responsibility it hands back to you. Share it with your friends, your family, your community, because awareness is the first step toward action. Like this video if you believe in real accountability. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the stories that matter, the ones that reveal the truth behind the headlines. And when you share it, you're not just passing along a story, you're passing along a warning, a lesson, and a challenge. Because if we don't stand for accountability together, we will all pay the price alone.